The vision of the McKenzie Delis review was to create a diversity report that looked not just at the single issues such as race or gender when it comes to diversity, inclusion and belonging, but one that looks holistically at all of the visible and invisible facets of diversity which make each and every one of us unique. By factoring in these 10 specific facets of diversity, inclusion and belonging, organisations can get a very real and measured account of exactly where they are today. They can then look at the ways in which they can move their dials significantly forward by identifying the areas that need the most work and development. The McKenzie Delis review encourages organisations to step up and look at where their organisations are performing well and could do with additional support when it comes to the 10 facets of diversity, inclusion and belonging. We really encourage leaders to look at an approach which is based by scientific methodology as opposed to purely common sense. It is together that we can move the dial forward. We hope that the stories and the best practice methodologies that are shared inside the pages of the McKenzie Delis review will equip your organisations and leaders to be able to really learn best practice and achieve holistic moving of the dial in the right direction.
Here in the UK, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you and those of you online to this event. It's going to be a phenomenal event. I'm really excited, as you will hear probably a bit later. But I have the pleasure, for those online, please bear with us, I have the pleasure for the health and safety announcements. This is a highlight, so quick one. No planned evacuations today, so if the alarm bell goes, that means we have to leave. So there'll be people here to guide us as to where we need to go, and there's signs outside. Your visitor passes, for those of you who've got one, has got some great information around fire, health and safety on the back, but most importantly, the Wi-Fi code. So you've got that on there. So now we've got the formalities out the way. Today is going to be a really exciting event, and I've been looking forward to this because I've watched how the review has evolved over the last couple of years, and absolutely delighted to be co-chairing this with Simon Woolley this year. It's been an absolute pleasure, and congratulations to Layla and the team for the launch in the US a couple of weeks ago. Again, what an incredible report that has been, and the people I've spoken to have certainly said it's been really informative, and most importantly, it helps start to move the dial. No pun intended there. But today is about bringing businesses together to be a greater force for good. It's about sharing best practice, but learning from each other. None of us do all of it right. None of us do, it perfectly right. So this is about learning and actually improving, and this is a bit of a journey. And this really helps to continue to give us the focus on inclusion, diversity and equity that really does deserve. And in every conversation that I have with my peers, this is one of the top 3 things they talk about. And people are beginning to use the word inclusion more, and I'll maybe elaborate a bit more later by what I think about when I talk about inclusion. So it is absolutely not just an imperative for those of us in the room. I hear it all the time in all the conversations I hear. So I'm really looking forward to things really moving on in the next couple of years too. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to Layla to get us kicked off for this afternoon. So Layla.
And thank you all so much, those who are at home or in the office, watching virtually, and those who are here in real life. It's just brilliant to see so many 3D faces in front of me. So, to start off with, I should probably do a nod and a thanks to everyone and to the KPMG team who have put this together so beautifully for us today. At this unprecedented time in our history, it is more important now than ever before to really harness the medley of talent within the UK and in the wider world. There is such a rich smorgasbord of talent in all aspects of diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And what we've really tried so hard to do at the Foundation is to be able to bring those facets together to create true, actionable change. We created the McKenzie Delis Charitable Foundation to be able to look at these 10 holistic facets of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity. And I know that each and every one of us is diverse in our own right and has our very own story to bring to the table. As the adopted daughter of 2 white working-class British parents and a proud dyslexic, I know that diversity means many different things to different people. And so I'd love, as we go throughout today, for you to think about which areas of diversity really relate to you and which areas are most pressing and important for you and your organisations to uphold at this critical point in business and in wider society. We've had a tremendous response to this year's review. I remember when it was a pilot and we were knocking on lots of doors talking about this review and what intersectionality meant. And a couple of years ago, it was really not something that was talked about a huge amount. And we managed to bootstrap together with some of our brilliant, brilliant supporters and make it happen. And so to watch it come to life now with nearly 100 listed and large organisations participating is really a huge, huge dream come true. And a number of you are here today, sitting in the audience, watching at home or in your offices. We're so thankful to you for helping us put actionable insights against all of these different areas of diversity. And so, whilst there is no shadow of doubt that there is a very long way to go for organisations in the UK and in the US, as the team and I have just come back from New York, where we had our inaugural launch, which I'm terribly proud of, there are still so many things that we can continue to do in order to keep moving that dial in the right direction. And it takes each and every one of us to do that, leaders, organisations, those in positions of power, to make that change and to really tackle those issues when it comes to actionable insights. So I hope you enjoy today. I hope you enjoy flicking through the pages of the report. There's some fantastic case studies in there. We like to talk a lot about leading practice, more so even than best practice, because arguably, is there ever a best practice solution to things? We are constantly evolving, we're constantly moving. Diversity now, I'm sure, will look like very different things in the future. And so thank you again to all of those who have backed and supported us, our incredible co-chairs, Bina Metha and Lord Simon Woolley, the review committee, and everyone here. And enjoy the afternoon. I can't wait for the discussion.
Thanks, Layla. Thanks, Bina, for your hospitality and for KPMG's. Layla's a really long way away from me. And this writing's really, really small, but we'll do our best. Hello, welcome to the first of today's panels. And today, as you will now know, I'm joined by our incredible McKenzie Delis Review co-chairs, and of course the very, very incredible founder and CEO of Dial Global and the McKenzie Delis Foundation itself. And today's panel is entitled DEI Commitment Starts at the Top, Getting Leadership Buy-in, Results and Insights Across the 10 Facets. And as you can see, we are very much at the top today. My name's Andrew Denton. Most of the time, I'm the Chief Exec of Alpha Financial Software PLC. But much more importantly today, I'm the very proud co-chair of the McKenzie Delis Charitable Foundation. I'm very proud indeed of the report that we've been able to give to the world. So I'm joined by three phenomenal leaders who I'm delighted to welcome on stage today. They are McKenzie Delis, who of course you know, the Chief Exec of Dial Global and the founder of the foundation, Bina Mehta, the Chair of KPMG UK, and Simon Woolley, Principal at Homerton College, Cambridge University, and founder of Operation Black Vote. Now, D&I agendas have traditionally focused on gender, race, and sexuality, but diversity encompasses, as we know, so much more than this. In 2022, organisations will need to broaden their thinking and their efforts to harness more than visible diversities. The McKenzie Delis Review was created to help organisations track and measure the 10 facets of visible and invisible diversity, and as Layla has already said, we are doing our very best to get the idea of intersectionality onto the map. So please join me with the chairs of the McKenzie Delis Review to learn why they've become involved in this important diagnostic survey, why they feel it's imperative that all companies bring the same rigorous measurement to diversity and inclusion that they do their other business success factors and KPIs. But before we get into detail, it'd be great to learn a little bit more about each of you and why you're so passionate about diversity, inclusion and belonging. And Layla, can we start with you, please?
Thanks so much, Andrew, and thank you for being one of our brilliant trustees. I, in my introduction, gave a little bit about the personal aspects that are key to me when it comes to diversity. I truly think that this relates to each and every one of us. And in particular, I feel it's so important for us to be able to look now at CEO-2 in leadership, because that's ultimately where we're seeing a lot of the challenges when it comes to all of these aspects and how there is a bit of a pattern the higher up we go in the classical corporate hierarchy. So it's really important to me that holistic diversity is recognised and that we appreciate that there's no cookie cutter model to success, even though we see some brilliant things being done by British business and the leaders we have here today.
Thanks, Layla. And can we go in seating order? You next, Bina, please.
Yeah, sure, thank you. So for me, I think the reason I'm passionate, as I suspect a lot of people are, is I come from a position of lived experience in my own world of holistic diversity. But I actually am really proud to lead a diverse board at KPMG that encompasses many of the facets we see in the report. And I see the benefit, I see the quality of conversation, the quality of decision making. So from a business perspective, it's the absolute must because it gives you competitive advantage. But actually, I see it in the way that we come together. So for me, the reason I'm passionate is I think we're moving away from diversity into what I call inclusion. And inclusion is how we embrace that diversity and how we leverage it for the benefit of each other and what we stand for. And I think inclusion is at the heart of belonging. You talk a lot about belonging, Layla. It's at the heart of belonging. And belonging is the foundation on which each of us can thrive and really achieve our potential. So that's why I'm passionate, because if you can do that, you're enabling a whole group of people to thrive.
Brilliant. Thanks, Bina. And in anticipation, I think we'll get a little bit underneath the hood with inclusion at KPMG as well. Simon, would you mind going next?
Yeah, no, I guess for nearly the last 30 years, I've been an activist fighting for social and racial justice. And in some measure, I see myself as a disciple of Dr. Martin Luther King, and not just having the dream as he had, but also a plan on how you fulfill that dream. And so for 25 years, I was really fortunate to be at Operation Black Vote and change quite a lot of the faces in Parliament. And now I've got a great honour of heading up Homerton College. I'm being the chair, co-chair.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's get on to some questions for the panel. And again, starting with you, if that's okay, please, Layla. Why is holistic diversity, intersectionality, and measuring across the 10 facets so critical to organisational performance and inclusion culture? Kill us with data, go on.
Well, as I said before, I don't believe that there is a cookie cutter model to success every organisation has its unique idiosyncratic details. Every organisation has certain things that it's doing well and certain things that it's not doing so well at. So for us to actually look at every single organisation and say, hey, this is the solution, in my humble opinion, is entirely wrong. And that is the great thing that we have seen about the review and the report, is we've seen some organisations doing brilliantly well. We've seen some, I dare say, who have not even started to scratch the surface. But we know what gets measured, gets managed. And so by pinpointing which areas are doing well and less well, perhaps, or we have challenges with, we're then able to put the right interventions in place in order to really see positive affirmative action. So it's about bringing together not only hearts, minds, the stories, the leading practice, but also making sure that we have the rich data behind that and the movement behind it. Because as I know Simon and myself were together this morning actually, there is so much frustration from many individuals who have watched for years systemic challenges which have not allowed true equity, and that is really what we're looking at. To hit you with a couple of stats to your point, we saw from the survey, which you'll all be able to unpick later on, that a quarter of businesses, when it comes to LGBTQ+, have only, a quarter of businesses, with LGBTQ+, will put this at the front of their leadership strategy. And 2/5 have got no ethnic minority representation at all. And that's after we've seen some of the challenging world events, such as the brutal murder of George Floyd, again, which we were speaking about this morning. And so there's negatives, but there's also positives when it comes to some of the movements that we are seeing. And it's now really how we can harness best practice from one another to move the dial faster.
Brilliant, thank you. And help people out, because everyone's on a journey here. And the whole point of producing a diagnostic report, rather than just another piece of white paper and a load of data, was to try to give people practical advice and help them on their journeys. How would you have people use the report? What's the best way to harness the power of, to your point, leading an evolving practice that we're seeing completely unpacked within this report?
Well, first of all, organisations have got to be brave enough, like everyone is here today, to get involved and do the report. It's aggregated data, so ultimately it's about the carrot more so than the stick. And we're not putting organisations up there and saying, hey, look, these are all the problems that you have. What we're doing is we're giving insights into organisations at CEO -2, having looked at every single one of these 10 facets, cross-checked all the intersectionalities, and we're saying, right, this is where you sit right now, and we're giving you the opportunity within the next year to actually put tangible metrics behind moving some of those key aspects forward.
Brilliant. It's a hugely important point, isn't it? I've been on record on some snackable content that you might have seen, saying why wouldn't you get involved in this? But it's really important to tell people that by responding to this survey, it doesn't put you on the naughty step. We're all on a journey. This is about actually being able to contribute to a data set that will help everybody affect societal and organisational change. Bina, Simon, would you like to come in on any of those points?
I would just echo what you've just said. This is about informing some of the decisions and actions that we take. Look, as businesses, we want to leave a positive impact, not just for our clients, not just for our colleagues, but in society, right? So there's a bigger movement here. But the report helps you, we always hold ourselves to standards, and sometimes you miss them and sometimes you do really well. And this report starts to help you where you need to start focusing on, because I think the holistic piece of this is focusing consistently across and not just focusing on one or two silos, because you'll never then get that inclusion and diversity that we're looking for. But not, yeah. So.
I would say there's a bigger point that we should be discussing than this. I mean, this is part of the discussion, but there's a bigger picture. And the bigger picture is, at least one aspect of that bigger picture, if we were to go back 2 years 2 years today, what were we seeing on our television screens? We saw on a daily basis a kaleidoscope of people who were dying disproportionately because of COVID-19. And in that picture, you saw disproportionately so many black and brown faces. I think it was of the first 105 doctors, 102 were black and brown. So we knew something dramatic was happening. They were cleaners, they were porters, they were doctors and nurses, bus drivers. And often they were in these jobs because they had 0-hour contracts and they had to work. Or they were overly exposed and not protected. And so what we saw in the workplace was certain areas that were racialized, either poor pay or no management. And we were struck by that, shocked. We knew something was wrong in our society. And then a month later, we saw George Floyd being murdered. And then the whole world was convulsed that something is dramatically wrong. What I enjoyed after all the heartache during those months was what was happening in big business. Because for the first time in my lifetime, CEOs were saying, if we're supporting the Black Lives Matter and we want a fairer society, then we have to lead. And in that conversation, they looked around their boards and their managements and said, look at what we look like. Does that look remotely good? And they had those stories. Some of you may have been in some of those stories where a black woman would say, I've been training white people for the past 10 years, and then they're my boss. And they get promoted, and I stay where I am. And so it convulsed the most dramatic, brave conversation. This was part of that, as a matter of fact. But whilst this is useful, really useful, by the way, it comes down to you, every single one of you, to say, do I look at it and think, oh, that's interesting, and it's business as usual, nothing much changes? Or do you say, I will use this booklet, I will use this resource because I want to demand change? You know, let me say that I was on my hobby horse, a little bit like this, and I get a call from one of our attendees, Dame Martina Milburn. And she said to me, I don't know if I embarrass you too much, Martina. She said to me, I like what you're saying, Simon, and if you don't mind, will you say it to His Royal Highness Prince Charles? So I did. And he liked it. And he said to me, Simon, what are we going to do? I said, what are we going to do? I said, you're the future king. You know, you can convene people. And he did, to make a difference. And so this is about leadership. We want the change, but are we brave enough? Are we strong enough? Do we care enough? Do we care enough to go from idea to seeing that change? And I'm really pleased to be with Bina, because I know that she wouldn't like me saying it, but she's an activist too, in terms of that how you say it, which is good, and then do it. So I think all these conversations today, you have to come back to the question that there are a lot of things out there that are grossly unfair. And not just unfair, oh, that's a pity, but we're not doing ourselves justice when talent's locked out. We have to bring that talent in, value it, and watch it excel. Thanks.
Thank you, Simon. Powerful words. And I think that touches on where we're going to go a little bit with Bina next, because the point of the report is to support a far, far broader societal issue, which Simon articulates beautifully with data, because activism is absolutely not about just saying some nice things on LinkedIn, and it's not about just doing stuff. It's making sure that we don't backslide And the only way that we don't backslide, or at least we can understand whether or not we are, is with measurement. Which brings us quite nicely through to Bina and understanding why you think it's important that the broad dimensions of diversity are measured, and what that's done to create a diverse and your target word, inclusive business at KPMG, Bina.
Yeah, so I think the beauty of these reports is that it shines a bit of a spotlight, because if you then apply the lens on your own business, it helps really shine a spotlight. Look, and each and every one of us will relate to 2 or more of those facets at any point in time in your life. When I did a quick tot up when we were sitting there, I can tick off 6 of them. Right? I now actually hit into the age category too. So actually, no, but it's interesting, because I think there are some facets that we just, because it's not something we focus on or it's invisible, it can get lost in the focus on a very specific thing. So I think there's a real importance in shining that spotlight, which is why I sort of talked about you have to keep momentum moving along. You have to prioritise. And we've worked with Nick for a number of years, and you're going to hear from Nick shortly, around the socio-economic piece, because you have to choose to disclose. You don't, and that comes on to the point. The issue is, we need to collect the data, and it takes time. It took us 6 years to collect the data so that we were able to then disclose the socio-economic makeup of our workforce, our executive team, and our board. And that was thanks to Nick. And and there's a whole bunch of stuff that's happened in the background around progression analysis, because we talk about the structures and the barriers. You can't address those unless you've got the data. So data's number 1. Number 2 is targets. You talked about what measures get managed. Targets are good because it holds you to account. You can hold yourselves to account, but you've got to be mindful that taking decisions to achieve a target in the short term doesn't unravel and create unintended consequences that you can then have to for the longer term, right? Because this is a societal change. It's not about my tenure and role or leadership's tenure. It's about long term. So that's number 2, targets. Number 3 is programs. So on the back of the murder of George Floyd, we did a lot of work, and Senda's in the room today, who led a lot of work around supporting our Black heritage colleagues. And we do programs for females. We do programs for people, so actually having targeted programs to support those, and and actually then following it through to see, do these individuals get promoted?
Right.
So I can say, Senda will correct me, I think about 43% of those colleagues that were proactively part of this programme were promoted in the last 2 years. Right, yeah, thank you. So there's no point just doing it, it's the follow through. So it comes back to the last thing that we do is transparency. It's got to be transparent. So as an organisation, we launched our impact site. So if you go onto our website and look at our impact site, we are very transparent. We're not proud of everything, because sometimes the data uncovers uncomfortable truths.
Sure.
But if you're not transparent, then you can't hold yourselves to account. Our leaders have goals that are tied in to this, and that includes inclusive behaviour. Are they inclusive? Work allocation. There's lots of things we look at. And then we get measured on it, and our remuneration is tied to it.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's taken a long time to get us to, but there are different levers that you pull at different times.
That's really interesting, and I mean we're the same, and it makes such a huge difference in terms of the way you're perceived if actually your bonus is entirely tied to having an inclusive organisation. But I'm personally really interested in how you've made that move towards getting people to accept the idea of revealing their socioeconomic status, the facets of diversity to affect them, because it's a gross generalisation. When the people in the big offices start to ask for data, then it can never be a good thing, right?
Yeah, so there is always concern around data and providing your data. So first of all, they know it's anonymous, it's anonymised, right? But I tell you what, the power of disclosing something and then people realising, oh yes. So what was really overwhelming for me when we launched our socioeconomic data in September was the sheer number of external contacts, but my internal colleagues, not just senior colleagues, very junior colleagues, who our median age is 28, right? So I'm kind of real in the minority in terms of that profile. And the pride in those youngsters who emailed me and said, it's not, I'm proud to work for KPMG, but my family, my friends have all written to me to say how proud they are that I work for KPMG. And again, you know, that person's disclosed to me that they may come from a low socioeconomic background, so it's not something we would share. But actually, that tells me if people understand the power of disclosure and what you can do with that disclosure, then but you have to bring people on the journey with you, right?
Yeah, absolutely right. Anybody else care to chime in on that journey?
I'd love to chime in on that, just to say that it really is. It's about creating these safe spaces, because we all know there's no one silver bullet methodology that will equal success, but digging deep into socioeconomic background, which I think is really key. And it was, you know, the super brave, hairy targets there that KPMG, just as an example of one of the many businesses, have put out there. And I think there's so much fear in businesses in general that they will do something, say something, get it wrong, be kind of shot at. But ultimately, no one of us is perfect. You know, better to put something out there and have something to be able to strive towards. But it's critical that we do continue to engage externally, our customers, our suppliers. We represent the audiences, the customers in which we serve, but we also bring that internally as well, because future generations of leaders, I'm sure, will not forgive us for not trying to do the right thing. There's 5 generations now in the workplace. 5.
Absolutely.
Biggest being millennials, zillennials. They care so deeply about purpose. It's really, the world of work has really kind of flipped on its head. You know, we're talking, hearing a lot at the moment about the, you know, the great retention, as I like to call it, but ultimately, you know, it's, you know, we've seen huge amounts of people drop out of the workforce, and a lot of the time it is due to their change in belief system for the type of organisations they want to work for.
Well, to Bina's point, people want to work for organisations that make them proud, but before Simon chimes in, it's such an important point that you make around socioeconomic mobility. We've discussed this on DAL panels actually in the past, that it's almost the ultimate intersectionality, because so much inequity leads to a lack of socioeconomic mobility. So what an important one to focus on. Sorry, Simon.
No, I would just say that the leaders set the tone. Bina has set the tone in this place. And I think it's that people buy into. And if people can see that actually that the cake is going to get bigger, it's not if you win, you lose. Actually, if you get it right, it gets bigger and you get better and you get a greater sense of belonging. And I think that's the leadership, the tone of Bina's leadership at this place, in which, you know, young working class kids, whether they're from Bradford or Brixton, will say, I want to work there because I can go from A to B to great success. And I keep saying it should be a win-win. Although there is a question, and we had this in our conversation earlier on today with Co-op, that there is an uncomfortable truth, a reality that some people will lose, actually. It's not a win-win-win-win-win. I think somebody put it that actually those that will lose will probably be mediocre, rather than look at it that you know, if the black woman wins, the white man loses. Someone said, no. If the white man is brilliant, they will stay. The mediocre person will go. I thought that was a great way of putting it. But the leader sets the tone.
Agreed. So following it up, Simon, how can organisations use the kind of data that we see now in the McKenzie Delis review report and those insights to drive, I've underlined the word here, sustainable change?
Yes, sure. Well, you mean you have to have a baseline. You have to see where you are, and often it's uncomfortable. And I think you need to acknowledge that it's uncomfortable, but say this is where we are going to go, not where we'd like to go, where we're going. And it's complex too. You know, all of us on this panel have got a variety of identities, right? And we own it. We own all of that. We embrace it. It's what makes us who we are. And so it is multifaceted. But data is king if you have an open mind and you use it correctly. And you can use it as a North Star to say, well, okay, so where we are, this is where we're going to go, and this is how we're going to measure it every step of the way. Because otherwise people feel, well, you're doing it, aren't you, because you're black. rather than actually that we want people that look like me and you and others to be the best company.
Anybody else like to chime in on that?
I was just going to say, touching on Simon's point, I know he's very modest sometimes, but he's the first black man of Homerton College to be principal, and that is just something to be truly commended. And when His Royal Highness recently visited Homerton College, and there was young, well, I want to say kids, but young people coming up, waving at Simon in the corridor, saying, "Oh, great to see you." This, it was just absolutely touching, because if you look at, and no privilege is one of many dimensions of diversity, but you look at some of the classic universities in Cambridge and Oxford, and you look at some of the change that is happening, it is just fantastic.
Well, I think it's
to see.
I think it's that and more, and I would argue the same for Bina too. And I'm fortunate enough to be the first black man in any Oxford or Cambridge college, which is 60 colleges. And sometimes you don't understand the enormity. I mean, I just think to myself, just do what you do, right? And cross your fingers. And then I remember once going to a matriculation dinner where the students dress up and they have a fine dinner, etc., and I come away a little bit tired. And I was just on my way home, and somebody stopped me. An Asian woman stopped me, and she was a third-year student. She said to me, "Simon," she said, "you have no idea what your presence means to me and people like me at this place." She said that I've been here 3 years, and I look around this building and I look around all the other fancy buildings, and I don't see you or me ever. Occasionally, yes, but hardly ever. And she said, not just do I see you as our head, but how you speak about what we can do. And she cried. And I think that we would be remiss to not to see the way that we speak, the way that we act, the way that we want a better space for everyone, that how much it moves people. And then them very same people will want to do well for you. So it's a win-win, because you're creating that climate. So, being where you are, being in these institutions, right? Ordinarily you'd be locked out, but you're in, and you're owning the space, and you don't feel like you're an imposter, because you've got a lot to offer. So maybe sometimes stop the imposter syndrome and do what you do, because it inspires a generation out there to follow you.
Thank you. Anybody else like to chime in on that, Tina?
How can you follow that?
Well, I'm gonna have a go. Well, look, thinking about imposter syndrome a little bit, it's been a real pleasure to chair these absolute titans of inclusion. Thank you very much indeed for your time on the panel. I've written down some key points. Whether or not I can do anything like justice to the conversation, but I think we've heard about why measuring holistic diversity is important. We know, and you'll hear this a lot, and you'll see it all over our website, that what gets measured gets done, and as Simon has articulated passionately, we really do need to do this, and therefore we really do need to measure. We talked about how using this kind of data can create an inclusive culture and has created an inclusive culture at KPMG, and now more than ever, as we're all engaged in the war for talent, that little difference of being proud for the organisation that you work for, feeling represented, as again with Simon's anecdotes at Homerton, feeling like you belong can be the difference between retention and recruitment or not. And I'm going to steal lots of sound bites from Simon, but I do like it's not always a win-win. The only thing that loses is mediocrity. But importantly about using the review to drive sustainable change. Again, I'll nick one from Simon, the idea of Martin Luther King's dream, but we do need a plan. And having a plan and understanding whether you're succeeding at that plan requires data, and shameless plug, the McKenzie Delis review report can provide you with that data. So please do join us after this short break to hear from some more extraordinary leaders who are leading the charge with driving, we just talked about it, socioeconomic diversity in their strategies, learn about the steps they're taking, why they see this as the biggest game changer. Of course, don't forget to download the UK McKenzie Delis review report. And again, I'm going to be really, really shameless. We are a charity, which means that we need money. So we rely on corporate partners, many of whom you've seen flashed up on the screens today. But we need more and more corporate partners, please, to help fund what I hope you are convinced, if you weren't already, is very, very important research. But for now, thank you very much for your attention, and please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.
The vision of the McKenzie Delis review was to create a diversity report that looked not just at the single issues such as race or gender when it comes to diversity, inclusion and belonging, but one that looks holistically at all of the visible and invisible facets of diversity which make each and every one of us unique. By factoring in these 10 specific facets of diversity, inclusion and belonging, organisations can get a very real and measured account of exactly where they are today. They can then look at the ways in which they can move their dials significantly forward by identifying the areas that need the most work and development.
The McKenzie Delis annual review is the most comprehensive corporate survey that really digs into the 10 facets of diversity and inclusion. The 10 facets are important because it actually puts a framework around it that makes the industry have a better opportunity to manage it in both the UK and the United States. The diagnostics in the report help organisations benchmark it themselves against what the industry is doing, how they report, measure, but most importantly take action on the findings across the report. It's useful data that, in my opinion, everybody who is responsible for culture should absolutely read.
So you should take time to read the report, and I know there are many reports that cover the different characteristics. The reason for it though is it really is that one-stop shop. It has all of the 10 facets in there, but also it's great because it gives you feedback about how you're doing. There are fantastic case studies in there, and what I really find valuable is there are absolute nuggets of ideas that you can take and you can put them into your organisation. You can create a fantastic discussion in your organisation from all the insight that's in there, but through those ideas you can actually turn those conversations into action.
The future of diversity is in reporting. It's so important. We say at the foundation, what gets measured gets done, but you can't improve unless you can measure. And so it takes inclusion, diversity and belonging within all forms of organisation to a place where you actually know if you're making progress, you understand what your baseline is, and unless you can do those things, it's just talk, it's just in the abstract. So what we do is we provide practical solutions to allow people to affect the change.
Not only do you get a report on how you scored as a business, that means that you can look at it and see where you're scoring well against other businesses or not so well, but it also then enables you to build a plan and actually really understand where there's opportunity.
As a diversity practitioner more than 15 years, it's really important to consider why you should do this review. And I would say that the McKenzie Delis review is overall the one that I would want to do because it covers so many different areas. It gives you research as well as insights and also fabulous case studies that tells you what the best of organisations are doing and how we can work together to move the dial.
We really encourage leaders to look at an approach which is based by scientific methodology as opposed to purely common sense. It is together that we can move the dial forward.
Thank you. And welcome to the second of today's panels with three more incredible partners to the McKenzie Delis review. The panel is entitled today, All on Social Mobility. The previous panel touched on social mobility several times, and I'm really looking forward to diving in a bit deeper to understand more about our three partners' experiences there and how we can drive that. My name's Joe Marshall. I work for Ipsos, the market research company. I sit on the leadership team of Ipsos, and being a complete research, insights and data junkie, I would just loved reading, getting a sneak peek of the review and seeing all the incredible insights coming through from that review. And I'm just convinced it's going to be a really great tool, inspirational piece for organisations as they can start improving on their diversity, inclusion and belonging practices. I'm joined by three phenomenal leaders who I'm delighted to welcome onto the stage. We'll get a chance to introduce them themselves in just a moment, but we have Kevin Hogarth, partner at and Chief People Officer at KPMG UK. We have Helen Webb, Chief People Officer and Services Officer at the Co-op, and Nick Miller, who is the Chief Executive at the Bridge Group and partner at the Moore Partnership. So coming through very strongly from the review is that most companies today have diversity and inclusion policies focused on race and gender in the workplace. But in these initiatives, very few companies include socioeconomic status as a dimension. And indeed, the review found that relatively few organisations include social and economic class in their strategy for their leadership team diversity, and low proportions of organisations are actually collecting data on socioeconomic backgrounds of their employees. And one of the challenges is really getting to grips with what we mean by social mobility in the workplace. It's an interesting issue. Social mobility in this context often refers to pathways into organisations, into core business functions, whatever those core business functions may be, and also progression into senior positions within an organisation for people who did not enter university, maybe have different educational backgrounds, and also those from economically disadvantaged backgrounds as well. And there's often some overlap between those two dimensions. While some organisations take social mobility seriously, progress has been a bit slower in this area, and it's often seen as a hidden facet of diversity, inclusion and belonging. But we're expecting to see a growing trend in 2022 and beyond of organisations working to reflect their communities that they're serving, the socio-economic diversity of their workforce and their leadership teams as well. And we believe that companies will need to better integrate socioeconomic status into the conversation in 2022 if they're going to continue to be inclusive and desirable workplaces. So before we get into the detail of this fascinating topic, I want to take a bit of time to introduce our panel. And I'd like to hear just a bit from each of you, just a bit about your background and why this is a particularly passionate subject for you. So we will start with Kevin.
Thanks, Joe. Delighted to be here. I'm Kevin Hogarth. I'm the Chief People Officer here at KPMG. Delighted to be hosting the event this afternoon. I work very closely with Bina. I'm a member of the executive committee and work with my executive colleagues on driving our diversity and inclusion strategy. I was thinking about the start of my career the other day, which is now a very long time ago, many decades ago, sadly. And I was thinking about the way in which the focus on diversity and inclusion has evolved over that time. Those words, diversity and inclusion, were never spoken. They were not words that were used 30 odd years ago when I started my career. We didn't really talk about talent either. That's another word that's kind of emerged into business lexicon. But that's actually what we were doing. We were looking at that because we were thinking about how we could unlock new areas of skills, how we could bring people into the organisation. My first job was a graduate job at the Boots Company in Nottingham, and we had a programme which most of you in the room are far too young to remember, which was called the Youth Trainee Scheme, YTS. And at the time, Andrew's shaking his head. At the time, that was a programme to bring young people who were unemployed into the world of work. And actually most of them are now from what we would recognise as low socioeconomic backgrounds. And what very quickly, I think I was probably only 23 or something like that, as I was only a few years older than they were. But I very quickly realised these were incredibly talented young people who had an enormous amount of commitment and enthusiasm. And actually, I hesitate to use the word grateful, but actually they were grateful for the opportunity that the organisation was giving them at a time of incredibly high youth unemployment. The loyalty that they then showed to the organisation over many years, in fact, unbelievably, I'm still in touch with one of those people now. And she had a very, very long and successful career at Boots. And I think I realised very early on in my career that actually giving access, fair access, to people who would otherwise not have those opportunities is a core part of the function, that the profession of which I am a part. It also, I think, really resonates with me just in terms of my personal values. Justice, fairness, equity, those are things that I care passionately about. Being able to work on creating fairer, more equitable workplaces has actually been one of the real privileges of my career.
Thank you. Helen, would you like to say a few words about what particularly you're passionate about this subject?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I work for the Co-op. Our purpose is around cooperating for a fairer world. And as an organisation that was actually born out of social injustice back in 1844, I feel as if I've landed in an organisation where my home is. I am passionate about equality. I've done a number of things in my career that have opened my eyes and helped me understand genuinely what organisations need to do differently. But just a little bit about me first, because I think that's important. Unless back many years ago there had not been full grants available, I wouldn't have been able to go to university. And therefore I'm hugely grateful of the opportunity that gave me, and very conscious it's an opportunity that lots of young people haven't got today. What I also tell people, when we are all many different facets of diversity included. I am sister to a disabled brother. He was born in the early 60s and is thalidomide. He was born without arms. And I think then he's older than me, he's 5 years older than me. And therefore from a young age could see the rage in him as the inequalities of the world became obvious, which is quite challenging as a younger sister. I think that there's a lovely meme doing the rounds at the moment that once you meet the older brother, you have to realise there's a crazy younger sister who's prepared to defend them. And that's definitely where I would say I am. I'm also very proud of him. He's a professor of astrophysics, so he's never let the world get in the way of him. I'm also partner to a black man, and I've had to take the phone call where his younger son came home from school, which is a very white school, and where somebody in the toilets at break time, a much older boy, had actually used the N-word at him. And the devastation that caused, and actually the way a very smart school in another part of the country to London dealt with it, I think has left quite a bitter taste, because the response was not to deal with the older boy because he had GCSEs coming up, and therefore they didn't want to upset him. So you can imagine the furore at that point. So, we are all made up of many different things. And my real academic and theoretical interest in diversity inclusion came when I worked for Aviva, which is, over 20 years ago now, when they asked me to do a piece of research based here out of their London office about what a global diversity strategy might look like for Aviva. And it was through that reading and that research that I developed a passion for this space, and it's a passion that I have held for many years. And, the conversation we were having with Layla and Simon this morning is there is so much to do, but unless, in Mary Poppins fashion, don't start somewhere and start to do something, then nothing will happen. And I think that's, when I'm asked by colleagues in other organisations, that's what I say, which is you have to think about what you can do that's going to make the biggest difference and start right now. So I think that's probably all I would say, because we've got many other things to say, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. And Nick?
Thank you, Joe. I'm Nick Miller, Chief Executive of the Bridge Group, as Joe mentioned. The Bridge Group was born about 12 years ago out of deep frustration on 2 counts, both of which have come up in the earlier panel. The first was a sort of bafflement about the enthusiasm with which organisations talked about diversity and inclusion and equity, but the complete lack of rigour with which they approach this topic. So we set about challenging firms to approach, to use your language earlier, this particular business challenge, opportunity, with the same rigour they would any other business challenge that was important to them. So have spent just over 10 years harnessing billions of data points, some of which I'll share with you later this afternoon, and evaluating what really works effectively. And I commend all of those who have invested so much thought and expertise into the report we see before us this afternoon. The other area of frustration, to perhaps echo some of what Simon was sharing earlier, was a deep frustration that there was a huge amount of mediocrity in the system and people who were in jobs they did not particularly deserve. So we have spent years trying to enlighten the majority group about the fact that diversity and inclusion is not out to get anyone. It's there to help put the best person in the job, and that should be celebrated. It needs evidence, it needs data, it needs practical action too.
Hear, hear. Thank you. So let's get into the topic of social mobility. And we've got 3 great questions. I'm sure we're going to have a really, really good discussion. And what we'll do is we'll start with Helen. So Helen, why should your company and other companies focus on social mobility in 2022?
I think it's an absolute imperative if you're actually going to address the inclusion agenda. I think Layla alluded to it before, which is social mobility actually is part of the unlock to address every facet of inclusion and belonging. And I think we have to pay particular attention to our young people coming into the workforce. 35% of our young people leave school without the basic maths and English qualifications. Therefore, unless industry steps in, we're not providing equality of opportunity. At the Co-op, we did a piece of research last autumn, which we termed the Ghost Generation. We spoke to 6,000 16 to 24-year-olds, really looking at the impact of the pandemic. 2/3 of our young people believe that the pandemic has impacted their employment prospects significantly. 2/3 of our young people believe that actually finding a job that is meaningful with purpose is almost impossible. You then look at actually the intersectionality within that data, and 42% of our Black young people and 40% of our Asian young people that were surveyed believe that essentially they are on a predetermined path, where only 25% of young white people believe that. So there is a problem, there is an opportunity gap. And at the Co-op, we believe that apprenticeships is part of the way to tackle that. So I'm still giggling about the YTS programme. Hopefully the apprenticeship route is a very grown-up version of what YTS was. But it's about opportunity to access apprenticeships as well, and closing the gap that there is for our young ethnic minority and particularly Black young people in accessing apprenticeships. Over the last 10 years, we've had 6,000 apprentices through the Co-op. And what we sat down last year and thought about is we alone cannot do what needs to be done. And therefore, we set up what is our levy share scheme, because the government have decided that we can give away, can't we, 25% of our levy share. But obviously, that goes with, the monitoring, the accessing to where do you find the apprenticeships that are going to access those disadvantaged communities. So I'm going to make a shameless plug now, Layla. If people have got unspent levy, then please give it to us and we will help you spend it. Our levy share fund is currently sitting at 10.4 million. We have already provided 560 apprenticeships. We're working with people like the London Ambulance Service, Manchester Fire and Rescue, Action for Humanity, Anthony Nolan Trust, providing apprenticeships that provide meaningful jobs. And our intent is by the end of 2023, we've actually closed that opportunity gap for young black people within our communities and other disadvantaged groups. So anybody that can make a contribution, and I know there are a number of organisations in the room that already have, we will help you spend it and demonstrate to you where your money is spent and the difference it's going to make. Because, you know, we cannot let our young people, A, be in the state they're in coming out of school with only 35% of them having the relevant qualifications, but B, believe that they don't have access to work, because it is so important if we're going to create the social mobility that actually our country needs. I'd also say something about data before I let you ask my colleagues up here. It's an interesting journey, data, but I think it's one you've got to provide a narrative around that helps people understand why they should give you their data and what difference it's going to make. We launched our data collection last September. We've got 64,000 colleagues, and 40,000 of our colleagues have already given us their data. So we're not resting on our laurels. We want 64,000 people to give us their data. But we feel comfortable, we're starting to make inroads, and we certainly collect it as people start with us. So we've kind of, we've plugged the hole to make sure that for the future we've got that data. What we also do, and we do ask socioeconomic data, and what we started to do also in our census survey, our engagement survey last September, is we asked for that socioeconomic data as well. So now we've got some really rich data about how our people feel about the co-op, how they feel about working for us, our purpose, what their day-to-day, job fulfillment looks like, their well-being, etc. And we can now slice and dice that every way possible, which is incredibly important to deciding what actions are the most important ones to take.
Fabulous. And I think having that data at the employee level as well, so you can follow up individually with individual strategies, is absolutely vital. Yeah. Nick, do you have any views on this? What should companies be doing to focus on social mobility?
Yeah, so to build on some of Helen's points, so in our data across hundreds of employers, we demonstrate that socioeconomic background has a really significant impact on access, on progression, on pay, on retention, and actually in most instances has a stronger effect on those things compared with either gender or race and ethnicity. Now that's not to suggest we should play diversity top trumps and argue which is more important, but it is to make the point that unless we have a focus on socioeconomic background as part of our inclusion strategies, we're missing a really important part of the jigsaw. And we've exposed and illuminated both in the data, the quant data and in the qualitative data, really important relationships between those three diversity characteristics that we have focused on to date. Socioeconomic background has a strong gendered element to it. For organisations that want to progress greater diversity by ethnic background, if they don't focus on socioeconomic background too, they miss an important part of the jigsaw. Again, that's not to suggest we play top trumps nor conflate any of these characteristics, but in the data, it really matters. I think the other rationale, Joe, for focusing on this area to be a bit more existential is around public trust. So we see in lots of the sort of macro reports around declines in public trust, that declines in public trust in our sort of leading organisations is intimately connected to the perceptions of who is running them. I was with one of our elected officials who helpfully said to me, you know the problem, Nick, people think that lots of our leading organisations are run by the elite. And I said, no, they are. Look at the data. They are. It's not a perception. There are some wonderful exceptions, of course. But generally, on aggregate, they are. And that perception and that disconnect between the communities that are being served by some of these organisations and the diversity amongst the people running them is a really important aspect of that public trust.
Thank you. Nick. Kevin. Don't worry.
That's the biggest compliment you've had all day, Kevin. It is.
I'll be very happy to be on a statement for Nick any day. think only a couple of points to add to the response of my colleagues. I think it's really embarrassing that in the UK, the link between socioeconomic background and adult outcomes is stronger than in any other developed economy. I mean, I think that is shameful. It is a national embarrassment. The other observation I would have is that this is not a conversation I have with my global colleagues. It doesn't feature when I have my conversation with my German colleagues about what's important on their diversity and inclusion agenda. It seems to be something which is, a particular issue here in the UK. And the cost is enormous. I mean, there have been many, many studies on just the cost to UK PLC, but in an environment where none of us can get the skills that we need into our organisations, it's unbelievable that still there are people who feel they're locked out of our workplaces. And one of the studies estimates the cost to be £39 billion. So, in terms of improving the performance of UK PLC, there's an imperative, and in terms of the UK and our standing in the world, in order to be able to demonstrate that actually this is a fair and equal society, then social mobility is one of the critical issues of our time.
Do you have any views on why this might be a uniquely British problem?
I do, but I probably shouldn't share them here. I'd probably reveal some of my politics if I were to share some of that. But I do. The Industrial Revolution started here. I think that the legacy that we have, our history. I think it's a multifaceted issue. It's wrapped up with our economics, our history. So I think that that is one of the reasons that it's a unique issue here in the UK. But it's an issue we've got to leave behind.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just to add, I don't think it is a uniquely UK challenge, to be frank. I mean, we are bottom of that league table around social mobility, and you have to work pretty hard as a society to stay bottom of that league table. But the US is not far behind us.
The US,
and some of our Western European colleagues, we're particularly hampered in this regard by geography. The London-centric nature of our country doesn't help, and all sorts of inequities throughout our education system as well. I should say our higher education system is world-class at three things: research, teaching, and perpetuating inequalities. Says the data, not my value judgments. There are some fantastic exceptions, but in aggregate, that's the effect.
Fascinating. Okay, well, let's move on to our next question, and this one is for Kevin. So, what are the three most important or successful actions that you've taken over the last 2 years that have positively impacted on social mobility, and what were the outcomes as well?
So I think that there are three things that are related to one another. We've touched on data quite a bit already, haven't we, Joe? And having we've worked with Nick and the Bridge Group for a number of years, and been tremendously helpful, I think, in helping us understand our way into this issue, and that data is so absolutely critical. And hearing what Helen was saying around the work that the Co-op are doing, that's the journey that we've been on, and collecting data. And Abina mentioned this earlier. So we've been collecting that data for quite a number of years now. And that's allowed us to do a couple of things in the last year. We've been able to calculate our socioeconomic background pay gaps. So adding that to the other pay gaps that we published, there's no statutory requirement to do that, but we felt that we published all of our other pay gaps. Why shouldn't we calculate our socioeconomic background pay gap included in our impact report on our website? Transparency. Is it great? Or we'd like many of our pay gaps to be smaller than they are, but putting that out there in the public domain, getting the organisation focused on it, galvanises action. You start to understand why is our pay gap as it is. What actions should we be taking to address it? And we were one of the first organisations in the UK to do that. So we're very proud, and it was part of the conversation that been a reference that, that publishing that ignited with our clients, within the organisation, with other stakeholders. And we can talk a little bit maybe later around the way that we did that, and Nick and his team were very helpful in helping us shape that. The other thing that the data has allowed us to do is to publish representation targets. Talk about targets on the first panel as well. So we have targets, as you can imagine. We have gender targets. We have targets for representation of ethnic minorities, black heritage, disabled colleagues, and with regards to sexual orientation. So we now have representation targets for people from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So we've set that representation target. We set it out to 2030, which is where all of our targets are set out to. And we've chosen 2030 because I think that's allowed us to be bolder and braver. Because setting targets, we were previously setting targets every few years, and we were incrementing our way towards those targets. And we weren't very comfortable in setting targets that we didn't think we were going to achieve. Publicly it's difficult, isn't it? When you don't hit those targets. Setting them further out to 2030, I think, has allowed us to be a bit bolder, giving us that sense where we've got a bit longer to try and address things and tackle things and understand what the barriers are. So we set a representation target for our senior cohort, that's our directors and our partners, of 29%. We're currently at 23% for our partners and 20% for our directors. So we've got a little way to go. And then the third and related part of that is the action plan. So Sam talked about, you need an action plan. It's no good just setting the target out there and sort of thinking, well, time will be our friend. We'll get there. You've got to actually look at the interventions. And so, looking at what works, we've looked at what works in other areas, and we've identified that targeted development programs, targeted recruitment programs, establishing our social mobility network, our employee network. These are all ways in which we can intervene to try and remove the barriers. Education, so the training that we do for our colleagues, understanding where social mobility fits within the overall landscape of our diversity and inclusion agenda. These are all interventions that form part of our action plan that are designed to help us close our pay gap and also over time achieve our representation targets.
Thank you. And do you think there are, you touched on this, but just some of the unique challenges to try and close that, if that's a core metric, that pay gap on social mobility, perhaps compared to other aspects of diversity and inclusion?
Actually, I think they are very similar. It's primarily around representation at the top of the organisation. It's and therefore how do you progress people through? When we look at the mix, particularly of our graduates and our apprentices, across all of our diversity metrics, it looks pretty good. We're doing a pretty good job at the entry level. Our challenges are really how do we retain and how do we progress that talent through the organisation, and having the data, and again another benefit of having that, having been collecting the data about socioeconomic background, we're able to use it in the same way as we do for all of the other dimensions of diversity and inclusion. We're looking at what rate people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are getting promoted. We're looking at the retention rates. We're looking at the amount of time that they spend in a grade. So that's all part of analysing where the barriers are.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And speaking for my own organisation, I can say there's definite parallels at the entry level. Changes seems to be much easier and quicker to effect. Mm-hmm. At the senior level, it takes a lot more time. I'm hoping that in future years, the problem will become less because of that progression of the more junior talent. But I totally see where you're coming from there. Helen, do you have any views on this? What the important and successful actions that your organisation can take on social?
Yeah, it's interesting because Nick raised education and how important it is, and I've already talked about statistics around education. But when we look at our apprentice sort of young people who are entering us at levels 2 and 3 apprenticeships. What we have started to do is we do pre-courses that are around getting maths and English up to a certain level so that people can get themselves onto level 2 and level 3 apprenticeships, and that doesn't have to be with us. So I do think big business has an obligation to look at what can we do pre-entry to our organisations to set young people up. And one of the founding principles of cooperativism is education, and the co-op sponsor the Co-op Academies Trust. So we actually run 28 schools in socio-economically deprived areas, predominantly in the north, where education is actually very different to it is further south if you look at that London centricity. And I think business has to start looking wider as to what can we do in society as a whole, not just about bringing people through our own organisations. And I think we've got to wake up to that, or we'll never get ourselves off the bottom of that particular table.
And Nick?
I'm often asked by organisations, what's the one thing we should do? And I think one of the big takeaways from the report and the narrative here is that there is no one thing. It's working incrementally across a whole range of areas. There are some obvious things organisations can do around attraction and hiring. Here's my best attempt at a silver bullet, though, and I hope it doesn't sound too abstract. We discover when we explore in organisations, we often ask sort of who gets ahead round here and how. And we often find many of the factors that contribute to people getting ahead, on the one hand, have little to do with job performance, and on the other hand, are much more readily available to those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. So language like confidence and gravitas and polish tend to come into these discussions. So the silver bullet for me, across all areas of diversity for that matter, is about precision around talent. What do we mean when we say we want someone who's performing well in the job? Can we be precise about that and assess it to the extent it's possible, as consistently and as objectively as possible? Because that's sort of circling the loop on the earlier comments about diversity is about putting the best person in the job. We therefore need to understand what that means and have the instruments and tools to make sure it happens consistently. So I think for me, organisations that are progressive in this space, and I see plenty of that in this building, it's where D&I is a really integrated part of talent management. Inclusion is not an initiative that happens, a piece of training you go to. It's good management. It's how you manage your team. That's where change happens among team leaders. That's where culture is typically created. This is not about an unconscious bias training session on a Friday morning. It's about weaving it into definitions of talent, progression, equitable models of work allocation, these sort of things that therefore affect directly progression. That's my best attempt at a short answer, Joe, sorry.
Thank you. And I'm very conscious of time, but we have just one final question that I'm really just keen for us to cover. And this is again one for Nick. How do you plan to create an environment to support socioeconomic diversity?
So I think there are different aspects to this, but I'll be brief. The data really matters here. By data, I mean collecting the quant data, as Bina was describing earlier. I think in asking people to disclose their socioeconomic background, you provoke conversations. You understand what's happening in the organisation. But then to pick up on, I think, Helen's point, we also need the sort of qualitative data as well to understand what's happening in the organisation. That is the evidence base on which to build a plan in this space. So it's not just built on intuition and hunch, because those things take us down different paths in my experience. So I think that evidence base is absolutely key. Two things which have been mentioned earlier today as well. One is about purpose, being really clear, not just in collecting the data, but in having a priority in this space. What's the purpose? What organisationally are you trying to achieve? And there are plenty of instances, Co-op KPMG, where this is a very legitimate, natural fit to the purpose of the organisation. So articulating that powerfully. And then finally, Joe, accountability. Mm-hmm. So this takes us back to treating this with the same rigour a business would any other complex challenge. What happens if it doesn't work? What happens if we get it wrong, if we don't make the progress we had committed to making? So keeping leaders and team leaders particularly accountable in this space, I think, is vital.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I think we're just about out of time now on this panel, but thank you very much to our three participants for an incredibly interesting, rich and thought-provoking discussion on social mobility. Some of my very brief takeouts. I think this whole idea about the challenges of social mobility and how social mobility, clearly not in KPMG, but across many organisations, is one of these hidden aspects of diversity and inclusion. It's something that we grapple with, perhaps as a nation, which we touched on, and that feeds through into the corporate world too. But it all starts, and I'm very happy to say this being a market researcher, with data. What data? Collecting that data on our employees to understand where those gaps are, the scale of the challenge, and importantly, what gets measured gets done, and then we can do something about it. I loved what Helen talked about very powerfully in terms of the role that apprenticeships can play, and in terms of really enabling people who wouldn't usually get those opportunities to enter the world of work and have a really strong career that has great progression opportunities. And that whole idea about governance as well, you know, the role that leaders need to play here, which Nick talked about, you know, the leaders holding themselves accountable for this. So there is the data, there are the programs of bringing people in, but also the role that leaders need to play as well. So it's a fascinating subject. I'm looking forward to talking about it some more, and there's lots and lots of data in the report on this area. So what we will do now is we're going to have a short break, just through there, and then we'll come back in about 5 or 10 minutes for the next section of our session. So thank you very much.
This report is so important for the future of diversity reporting because we have to think multifaceted. I think the pandemic really shined a light on the fact that if we're going to ask people to bring their whole selves to work, if we're going to ask leaders to build companies that are going to be here for tomorrow, we need to ensure that we're thinking about holistically how we're going to do this. And this isn't a charity case. There are many business cases that show that diversity really is something that we need to be focusing on, and this report shines light on all the different facets that we need to be focusing on in order to be doing that well.
One of my key themes around the work that I lead at Berkeley's is transparency, alongside accountability and engagement. And the power of the McKenzie Delis review is it gives us that opportunity to be really transparent, to understand where we are, where there are gaps, and then to help us define what we're going to do to make progress against those gaps.
It's immeasurable. I think it's going to help validate what many of us already know or believe, that diversity and inclusion needs to be woven into the entire organization. It needs to be at the forefront of all of our decisions. Our customers demand it, our patients demand it, our employees demand it, and frankly, all of our stakeholders are demanding it. So I really see the results of the survey as not only a validation, but a roadmap for what else needs to be done, because we can't simply rest on the accomplishments we've made in diversity and inclusion at Walgreens and WBA and with our partners, but we need to do more. So I think this report really validates, again, what we've done so far, but also giving us a roadmap of where we need to focus going forward.
For me, one of the major benefits of being one of the companies that actually participated in the survey is that we will actually receive a free, customized report that shows how well we are doing when stacked up against other companies. So for me, it was an opportunity to get a diagnostic that we would not have been able to complete ourselves. And so the collaboration, the partnership was already done for us. So I'm really looking forward to seeing our report and identifying where we have some opportunities and some gaps, but also where we can celebrate in terms of things that we're doing great.
Well, most employers, when I think about the benefit of this report and how it can help an organization, we talk about the value of our employees and that they're our most important assets. And one of the things about managing and taking care of your assets is knowing what you have. And so this report will allow leaders to really dive into, from soup to nuts, the true makeup of their employee base, what the hot buttons and the triggers are for their employees, what drives them to be successful, what gets in the way of productivity. And this report, I think, in my opinion, will help leaders to kind of solve some of those issues and challenges.
Hello and welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us, those who are just joining us now, those who have been here since the beginning of the afternoon. I'm joined by three phenomenal panellists in real life. I still can't quite get over being in real life with people at the moment, who I'm delighted to welcome to the stage this afternoon. Now, we're going to be talking about ESG. one of my favourite subjects, environmental, social governance, and I'm sure you've all seen that there's been a huge upsurge in the S over the last year, and it is set to continue for 2020. So we're looking at how diversity, inclusion, belonging and equity will be critical when it comes to investors, governments, boards and also consumers. My name is McKenzie Delis, and I am delighted to be joined by three exceptional leaders who will introduce themselves in just a short moment. We have Alison Jones, who's Director of Strategy for ICIS, a division of LexisNexis Risk Solutions, the longest company name ever, but I love it. Sarah Webster, Director of Responsible Business at Director of Sustainable Business at Britvic, I should say. Apologies, Ricky. And Ricky Alfred, Director of Responsible Business at Communisys. Welcome. So before we dive in deep, I'd love just to unpack a little bit about all of you personally, but also the work that you do in your day-to-day roles. I'm going to start with you, if that's okay, Alison.
Yes, certainly. Thank you. So I am, as you said, Layla, Director of Strategy at ICIS. It's a division of LNRSG. I abbreviate it because I too find it a bit of a mouthful and can't get it all out in one sentence. I've been with the company around 2 years now, and prior to that, I worked in a financial information service for 18 years. And I was lucky enough to have the most amazing sponsors throughout my career, but it was an incredibly male-dominated world. And I was thinking to what you were saying at the beginning in terms of what facets impact you and you personally. And I'm with you, age is definitely there. I'm in that category now. Parental, I have 2 relatively young kids, and so that's why I'm quite bleary-eyed. I have the age piece with perimenopause and my kids keeping me awake at night, so leading to the bleary-eyed view within today. I have very close family members who have both visible and invisible disabilities, and I've been unfortunate to witness the invisibility that has caused both of them in both corporate and within society as well. So that's sort of some of my personal motivations within there as well, and within the corporate world as well. When I started out my career, like I said, I was 9 times out of 10 the only female in a room looking at the gender angle of this. And it had a big impact on me. And like I said, I had the sponsorship to help me accelerate throughout my career. But I felt the need to really drive change within the industry. And I was fortunate enough to join the board of a company called the London Women's Forum, which supported women to progress through their careers within the financial markets. And as I've become more involved and passionate around inclusion and diversity, both from a personal and a professional standpoint, I have been made even more passionate by the stories from all facets of diversity that my colleagues, my friends, I've heard from attending fantastic events like this. And for that reason, the drive and the passion and the values that I have in the company, and I know everyone in this room will have, that every single individual, irrespective of all of the facets that we talk to, should have the right access, should be valued equally, should have access to the same opportunities. And that's what drives me within that. And my work enables me to follow those and really drive forward with that.
Thank you so much, Alison. And Ricky, I'm going to come to yourself next.
Thanks, David. Nice to see you too in real life. So a little about me. I am mixed heritage. I'm Irish and Black Caribbean. I have 2 children, 4 and 9. I'm with a lady who is white British. We are a very blended family. We are very multiracial. And I'm very purpose-driven. And that is my full-time job. Being a parent to 2 children, 4 and 9, that's my full-time job. On the side, I work for Communisys, And then I give that money to my children that I earn. But I'm really lucky to now be in a position in the role that I am, working with the organisation I do, to be empowered by our exec to fulfil my own personal purpose, which is driving the purpose of the organisation. To look at the how to the what we do, and continually be that annoying toddler in the meetings that continually asks, but why would we do that and not this? And bring that out. But I've been the only person of colour in a room for most of my career. You know, I walk in, and still to this day, I can walk into rooms and still be the only non-white face in a room of 100 people. And that is something that I am particularly passionate about for my children and for others. And now I'm in a position where I'm in the uncomfortable position of being a role model, but also in the position where I can affect change. But I don't want my children to walk into those rooms and feel uncomfortable. You know, I don't want my children to, whatever they may grow up to be, do in life, I don't want them to be judged by just how they look or what they do or how they speak or where they've been. And I feel that for all my colleagues. I was really lucky. We went and did some road shows face-to-face around the country, and it was really powerful listening to people and how much this agenda is meaning to them. But yeah, so very purpose-driven. I mean, I could talk for ages, but that's me.
Ricky, thanks so much. It's great to see you in real life. I know that we've had many a conversation where we've ended up running significantly over.
Yeah, we are two talkers, for sure.
Indeed. And Sarah, last but never least.
Well, thank you, Layla, and lovely to see people in the flesh. So I joined Britvic 2 years ago. I joined to head up the sustainable business strategy that we call Healthier People, Healthier Planet. There is a connection between the two because you can't have one without the other. And we will be talking about that far more, I'm sure, in our panel. And my interest in sort of diversity, inclusion and equity is twofold. There is the personal side of things. I am mother to, I would say, exceptional children. One, who is about to go off to university, and I don't want her to feel that she has to conform to other people's perceptions of what she should be doing. Equally, very smart, funny, neurodiverse son who, perhaps doesn't fit the standard education system that we have been talking about, and very ethnically diverse sort of family and nephews as well. And I think the same applies. I want them to be, we talk at Britvic about being our best selves, and I think the position we find ourselves, the climate crisis, social inequity, inequality, war in Europe, for heaven's sake, we need to have the best, most creative solutions to solve these dilemmas, and we're not going to do it by operating the same way we have been doing historically. And so that's how I take it into my day job. We have, and I'm sure many, many businesses are like this, we've spent 25, 30 years building that financial performance muscle. Now, I'm not against financial performance. I'm a qualified accountant, just to get that straight. However, if we compare that to the length of time we have spent building our people muscle or our planet muscle, there's a bit of a disconnect there. And I think the way that we readdress that balance is by diversity, inclusion, and equity and belonging, and making sure that people can bring their diverse backgrounds, their diverse thinking processes, their different approaches, their cultures, all into the mix to, generate these solutions that we so desperately need.
So I'm hearing innovation from all of you and lots of smiley faces when you're talking about children, which makes me happy. We're about to have our first, and I'm swinging between being incredibly excited and also absolutely petrified. But what's interesting that you've all talked about is environmental factors as well as the societal aspects. And we've seen the S really explode beyond recognisable belief over the last couple of years. The ESG role into itself, as well as the CDO role, the diversity role, they're two roles that are being recruited for more at present, and ones that we are constantly seeing a need for, and also, to an extent, sadly, a churn within these roles because they're so desperately required. And I wonder, Ricky, if I can come to you first, just to kind of set the scene around ESG, what this really means, the intersect between diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, data, and that on the environmental side. It'd be brilliant just to hear a little bit more about what you're doing at Communisys, because I know you're doing many great things. It'd be interesting just to hear about the emphasis as part of the ESG agenda before we then dive deep into some of the core facets.
So I've been doing this kind of role for getting on for 20 years now, and I would say in the last 2 years, you're right, I think it's been mentioned before, some of the things that have happened over the last 2 years with COVID, the disparities there, the murder of George Floyd, what we're seeing in Europe, it is a hugely accelerating agenda, I would say, from the perspective of the businesses, but then also their clients, their suppliers. There are lots and lots of questions coming at us. I would say 100% of our client responses include questions around this subject. The focus on it is growing, and both public and private sector. We probably all know about the Public Services Act, or if anybody's in delivering anything to the public sector, and how we build social value into those. Our clients have a tremendous focus on this. I will say that I think even within that space there is lots of questions at the start, whether or not they continue that and how we continue that and how we continue that dialogue with them is probably where there is more progress to be made. Our supply chain, we're seeing an awful lot of focus on our supply chain, so when clients ask us, they want to know what we're doing in our supply chain. And we have built into our approach and our purpose, everything that we do is around that. But we then get very specific questions from clients. So they will look at gender diversity, for example. And when we look at the 10 facets, you often wonder, when are we going to get the next set of questions? And I think what we're doing is preparing ourselves. So we're trying to do all of those things at once with our suppliers and with our own people, because I think arguably the greatest pressure is actually coming internally. So from the clients, from the investors, I think the activism and the employee activism we're seeing in this space is really pushing the company to do more. And that's, I've been with Communisys for 6 months now. It was exactly the same my previous job. The number of employees that would have this in conversations. We've all talked about recruitment, purpose-driven young people come into work. And if we're honest, we're all purpose-driven, and I think what's also happening is investors in particular, leaders within organisations are now knowing they are also enabled to ask those questions and to live their purpose. And through that, investors, they can spend their money how they want to. The last financial recession showed that the more resilient organisations are those organisations that have ESG at its core, that have diversity and inclusion at its core. The innovative organisations have diversity of thought throughout them, and when they don't have it in the room, they get it into the room. So very much a practice that we're following, and we are seeing more and more focus from our clients and from other stakeholders as well.
It's fascinating that you talk about there being more pressure perhaps internally. In particular, I know all three of you are real purpose-driven leaders, but it is great that it is a passion, but it is now an imperative from our younger generations. They're demanding this. It's not even just something that is a kind of a nice to have. It is an expectation that leaders are beacons of talking out proactively about societal issues, not just business as usual per se. Now moving on, Sarah, I'll come to yourself if that's okay. But I'd love for you to talk to us a little bit about some of the specific changes that you've implemented when it comes to the societal aspect and where diversity features within the S.
Absolutely. Well, sort of having listened to the earlier panelists, we do have targets. We do have some data. It's certainly not perfect. So a lot of imperfect data, but we are building on it. And so that is, you know, the first place. There's been lots of talk of what gets measured gets done. And a big piece as well for us is exactly as you were talking about, Ricky, that employee activism. You know, it's our network groups who are sort of the heart of driving this change agenda, actually. Within the business. They're employee-led, they're looking for solutions because they want everybody to be able to bring their best selves to work without that becoming, you know, too much of a cliche. And we've also seen that, you know, over the last couple of years, our working well philosophy, which is far more than just, you know, flexible working, but you know, that is a real magnet. That combined with our network groups and our employee voice, we're finding is a really important magnet or attraction way to get people to join Britvic. The number of conversations I've had is like, oh, it was because of, you know, I've seen this video on LinkedIn, or it's because of your Healthier People, Healthier Planet strategy. You know, that's why, you know, we joined Britvic. We do have, Nick, unconscious bias training, and that is essential for everyone at Britvic to do. We also have sort of the license to hire training. So any training manager, you can't recruit anyone until you have done that. And we use diverse job boards as well. So that is, you know, that is all, you know, some of the practical things that we are doing. And then, like many other businesses, we have community days because we understand the role that we have to play within, you know, within communities, and that for me is a real sweet spot as well, because it helps, you know, our employees like to give something back. It improves engagement. It helps their well-being. And the other thing that we're doing, which I think is quite unusual, is My Joy Days. Which, if you wanted to, you could go to a spa or just have lunch with friends. I did it doing university open days with my daughter. You know, just having that time to use as you wish is really, you know, really important. It really does help people feel valued within the organisations, and then they feel like they belong, like they want to give more of themselves. And then the final piece, I think, is that engagement, and it's sort of what we're doing externally. So being part of organisations such as Dial Global, for example, we took part in the government's Kickstart scheme. So we've been talking about YTS, you know, apprenticeships, Kickstart schemes. We've had over 40 young people joining that, and then there's the CBI Change the Race ratio. So we're doing an awful lot of things. And now it's very much, the proof is going to be in the pudding, in measuring that progress from our baseline and see where we get to. You know, we have published diversity targets out there, and making steady progress towards 2025, and to ensure that it, you know, hopefully it is in the minds of our senior leaders. It is included in our short-term bonus incentives as well. For senior leaders, so that always helps focus the mind.
It does indeed. I'm so pleased that you brought up employee resource groups there, or what are often called business resource groups, which I'd love to dip into in just a short while. But does anyone have any further thoughts around employee engagement and ultimately, you know, utilising, you know, our ERGs and our engagement strategies as ways to be able to retain and attract top talent?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love the term employee activism because I think it's so critical to driving this forward and driving that change. One of the pieces that we found, so we have a very engaged and committed CEO, so it's coming very much from the top. And there has been a recently, well, about a couple of years ago, established inclusion council that is headed up by top executives within the business, but then who are then also the sponsors, so the exec sponsors on the ERG groups because also I do believe very strongly, as I know everyone in this room will as well, in the need for that reverse mentoring as well, and for that need to that connection with the ERGs, employee resource groups within that. Now, it's such a critical part. We've all talked very much around purpose-driven organisations and the fact to attract, retain and develop diverse talent. Purpose is at the core of that as well. And the ERGs have such a critical part to play in this, in terms of how they are supporting and engaging on the recruitment, how they are supporting on the specific programs of work to retain and develop that key talent, but then also how we engage with industry, with our customers, how we share and come together to learn best practices as we are today to keep driving this initiative forward as well.
Yeah, if I can add, I think it's hugely important. We have a culture committee at Communities which is made up of, it's representative, it's all levels of the organisation, just so that when we talk about the decisions we're making, we can talk to this committee and they can give us their honest view about whether or not it's going to land, whether or not it appeals to them. But in terms of the recruitment, the ability to move people up through the organisation, I am very much a believer in the whole, if I can see it, I can be at peace.
Yes.
If I can't see it, I don't think that's the right place for me. And that's the same for anybody. So we're trying to move more into a space where it's our colleagues that talk about the organisation as opposed to the leaders in the organisation, which is important, but also getting our colleagues who are representative to talk about their journey within the organisation. We're lucky we have a 50-50 exec split gender-based. We have other areas to work at, but it's really important, I think, for our colleagues to see that and also feel that they can affect change themselves rather than it just being done to them. So, yeah, the more you can get colleagues talking to you, the better, I fundamentally believe.
Totally.
And for anyone who's listening in thinking, what's an employee resource group? It is, they're often called staff networks, they're often called business resource groups. We saw just at the break, Walgreen Boots Alliance, who called their groups business resource groups. And I love that because it denotes that they are a strategic business priority. And if I may be a little provocative for a moment, I will say that a lot of these employee resource groups historically have never been funded. They've been voluntary groups tagged onto the day job, which on the one hand is brilliant because they're driven by passion, and we've got so much passion here in the room today. However, they're not necessarily remunerated, and so they then tend to, sometimes it'll fall to to the back burner because there's the day-to-day job and the KPIs that are required in the day job, and this kind of falls behind the wayside. And what's interesting about each of your organisations, I know that you all have these employee resource groups, and it's almost how do we put strategy, to your point before, behind, and science behind making sure that these are actual strategic drivers to success. I wonder whether you could unpack a little more around some of the employee resource groups that you have, because I know that you're all exec sponsors for ERGs within your respective firms, and I know you've got loads of employee resource groups in your company. I think it's 35 or something.
We've got 35 and growing as the workforce evolves, definitely.
You sound like you're very well placed to answer that question first of all then.
No, from ours, there is specific budget that is allocated and focused around the ERGs. They are started through the employees, so the voice of the business essentially, and we have 35, which is a lot, but all of them have specific nuances and cater towards a specific audience where they want to have their voice heard. And we've recently just started one for, I feel like this all I'm talking about at the moment, menopause and perimenopause, for example, of which I am the exec sponsor to that one as well. But I think it's really important that you don't stifle where they focus, because then that, to the point you're making, Ricky, that's top-down direction, if you like. But if they're wanting a voice heard and they're not feeling that they are supported, or that they need that coming together, sharing of resources, to instigate change and drive debate around, do we have the right policies? Do we have the right support from health benefits, for example. And so they really are being true activists in driving that change throughout the business. And I think one of the key parts they play, and I feel very strongly around this, is around education as well. And the role of the line manager and all management is really critical here, because so often we put so much emphasis on the role of the line manager and sort of their role from probably 20 years ago when I started. It's so much more now. And the ERGs can help identify areas of education and support that is needed for that line manager to be able to really create that truly inclusive and supported culture that we want and need.
Absolutely.
I would agree. I think enabling and empowering them, also making sure that it's not side of the desk.
Yes.
Making sure that it's linked to, and they're recognised for the work
Yes.
they're doing, because these are big roles. So are they being recognised in their own PDPs, in their own advancement? Yeah. When you're looking for people, I think it was talked about earlier, identify the people that are really making a difference. These are great roles to do that. And the other side of it is the lived experience they bring, the education piece. But where I do find them really useful, actually, is outside of the lived experience. So when people who don't have that lived experience want to learn, and creating a non-judgmental space where you can dive into a topic around menopause that, to be fair, every single man who has a partner that is female should understand, because that's important. But I think that ability to bring everybody into the conversation, because the one thing we haven't talked about today, D&I can be extremely exclusive if you do it the wrong way. People feel that they can't join a conversation. We've had that in our workplace. I've had that at home, where my other half, during the whole George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter piece, felt really quite excluded, even with her own children, about the experience that they might, go forward to face in their lives. So creating that safe space, and I think the network groups and things like our culture committee allow that, where you can have those conversations and you can allow people to learn about a subject, maybe by observing before they actually join the conversation, and that's really powerful.
Yeah, that's so important. So I was going to say, I think that's such an important point you raised there as well, though, in terms of a lot of people want to get involved, but they're scared of saying the wrong thing or using the wrong terminology. And I know the ERGs that we have support those open conversations. They almost to the point of what can you say, what can't you say, and if you're not sure, ask. Yeah. So it's a very valid point.
Yeah, and I think what has come through from ours, and it is that, it's everybody is able to participate in the education across the business, and the courage, and that's one of our values as well, the courage that a lot of people have demonstrated in their personal disclosures to share their stories, whether they're a husband married to someone who's going through the menopause that's then helped them, with someone who was working for them, going through that stage, or all of people's personal experiences, really does bring it to life, because otherwise it can feel quite conceptual. And I think they are so powerful, and the value that these groups bring and the courage that they bring to share their stories, it's blown me away at Britvic. It really has.
One last question for you all, and I'll start with yourself, Alison, given that you are a strategic expert. But where do we see the future of ESG in the next, say, couple of years, 3 years?
That's a very big question. So, where to start with that even? If you think around ESG, and I'd say in the last 10 years, give or take, it's really gone from being on the fringe to really being mainstream. And if you look back 5 years, even, it was very much the E that was the driver. Obviously, climate change was there. We've seen the S coming to the fore over the last couple of years, predominantly, especially during lockdown as well. And one of the changes that we saw focusing in on the E is obviously we've seen governments and companies come out with the commitments on transition to net zero. And I just want to use an example that's very relative to the work that we do within ICIS, and I also know, Sarah, that judging from the conversation and the industry that you're in, and that's around recycled plastics. And I just want to take a bit on the journey as to where it'll keep going in my view, and please welcome views and thoughts on this, is when the topic of plastic waste first came out, so looking again into that E, it was very emotive, it's very visible, which means that consumers care, because the images that we saw struck a chord and people did not want that. I, for one, got so much pressure from my children as well, still do, on plastic bags, plastic bottles. It was, you cannot use them. If you think through that, governments care because the voters care, and that drove a lot of the regulatory change as well that we saw. Focused predominantly in Europe, but we're seeing that expand globally, and more is coming through on that. What we're now seeing, and we've seen for the last few years, is that it's the access to capital that is driving a lot of the change and the drive and the investment. We are seeing within the industry certain firms that are not hitting their goals, and we've seen a lot of companies come out very publicly with their targets around this, having to pay more for access to capital. And I see that is still continuing, that investor access to funds will continue. If we go into the S a little bit more as well, and we were having a conversation before we came on stage around this, is that yes, there is that drive, and there is that drive from the investment community and from the shareholders, but it's not as strong as it can and should be. And I hope that in the next 3 years, that trend we will see that increase, and it'll go away from gender and ethnicity, not go away from it, but increase, should I say, from those 2 core facets to the 10 facets that we are talking about as well. Whether that's in 3 years or longer, I don't know. But what is clear is that companies that have diversity, inclusion and equity as part of their business strategy, and not simply as a HR exercise, are those that will have the competitive edge, and that they will make the difference, and that they will continue to be able to attract, develop and retain that key talent going forward. And to something that is in the report, and I will use this because I couldn't agree more, purpose is, we're all purpose-driven, as we've said as well. And for the future, purpose and profits are no longer mutually exclusive, and I couldn't agree more with that statement on that as well. I think the third and final point that I will raise on this is around data. Many of us are very early on, we're collecting the data and more data, and I think there will be an increase on the requirements of the reporting as to what is disclosed and requested to be disclosed by companies across Europe, the globe, etc. But the point that I really want to focus in on, and this is a new, and I'm not a data scientist, so if anyone in the room is a data scientist, please don't ask me any questions on it. One of the areas as businesses, as we are starting to leverage more and more data and tech to drive our businesses from both an operational standpoint and as decision making as well, is that we are aware of not only the bias that we have in our physical world, but that we are also being very aware of bias that can be introduced by incomplete data sets that we are analysing, and also potentially unconscious bias by practitioners of this data and analytics as well. So where we see this trend over the next 3 years, where this will become more and more prevalent within the business world, it's more just a cautionary, let's just look at that data to make sure it is complete, that it has full diversity within there as well.
That was a superb summary. Any other further thoughts before we wrap up, and I worry about how I'm going to summarise all of the richness from this panel?
I think I would probably just say, and I touched on it at the very beginning, and there's been talk about transparency, more data. We now need to move away from rhetoric to action.
Yes.
And an ESG strategy, sustainable business, responsible business strategy, whatever you call it, actually, it is all about building a resilient business. So it is your business strategy. And that is what we will see more and more of.
Yes.
It can't be in a silo. It has to be completely integrated, because we are operating in a world that is, volatile than any of us have ever known in our careers. And we all want to have successful, resilient businesses, and this has got to be right at the core of it.
Yeah, I agree. I think the transparency, and the merging, and I'm not saying we've got this absolutely right yet. We don't have separate strategies. We have one singular strategy that has all of these elements built into it. And I think the trend is going more towards transparency, but also accountability. So while we're talking about the pay gaps and so on, I think equity is going to come to the fore far more now. I think that sense of belonging and what people want, the employee voices will get louder. I'm seeing more and more organisations having shadow leadership boards to bring diversity of thought and also lived experience that maybe the board doesn't have, if they don't have that diversity at board level. So I think those trends will continue in everything we are seeing. I think there will be more accountability. I think government, and we're talking very UK here, but I think this will be global. We're seeing it internationally as well. We're seeing it with where we are and the locations we operate in around the world. These conversations are starting, and I think it will go beyond the first question to the actually let's show progress and what are you doing, so the report, and everybody will want to see that. So I think more transparency is going to be called for as we go forward.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for your time on this panel, and I'm hearing that whilst E's been incredibly important and continues to be so, actually there is a convergence now between environmental, the societal aspects. We look very much at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, of course, of which there are 17, and then the 10 facets. There will be certain blurred lines, but ultimately they're critical overlaps because we often can't have one necessarily without the other. I particularly like the fact that we've talked about hearts and minds and the importance of storytelling when it comes to leadership, accountability, of course, but then also the critical voice of the employee and also the consumer. We want to see what we want to purchase reflected in our products, in our people, in societies in which we serve. And there seems to be very much a golden thread through everything you've all discussed. These are strategic imperatives now. Employee resource groups, diversity is not a nice to have, same as environmental is not a nice to have. These are absolute core pieces of strategic business decision making, not only now but for our critical future generations of leaders. So thank you all ever so much. It's been a really rich and insightful discussion, and very grateful for you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, what an incredible afternoon it has been. Thank you all so very much to our panellists, to our speakers, to our sponsors of the research, to our teams for being such a part of this. And now, hopefully the moment that many of you have been waiting for. You can see up here on the screen the top 25 performers. And these are the top 25 based on each and every one of those 10 facets. We've cross-checked all the intersectionalities there. The vast majority of businesses, you'll be pleased to hear, did choose to be named. There still are a couple that chose not to be named. However, this is what we are doing all of this for. It's inspiring, educating, it's motivating as many people, as many organisations as we possibly can when it comes to sharing leading practice, and also to be able to champion what our organisations are doing so others are able to learn. I personally have found the authenticity, the honesty, the candid nature of everyone who's been involved truly inspiring. And I hope you've all enjoyed this afternoon just as much as we have when it came to creating this report. Can see everyone's looking at the screen now, so I can see smiling faces there. I really do think those who have participated, of course, I'd be a little biased in saying it, deserve a huge pat on the back, because it is, it's challenging to put your head above the parapet. There's uncomfortable conversations to be had, but ultimately, the innovation, the proactivity, the positive differences that we see really are what our future generations of leaders, our external parties, our internal parties really do need to see. And it just shows that when you bring together businesses, you bring together thought leadership, that many great things can happen. And we're going to keep continuing to move and push the dial. We would love to be able to be celebrating again next year with even more organisations having taken part in keeping feet on the gas when it comes to such important, critical subjects. Now, I'd love to bring up on stage, if I may, some of the team who have been responsible for doing all of the exceptional work. They've worked so hard. We are a small yet mighty team. This charity only was started around 6 months ago, and it is really down to the people that have got involved and backed us in doing this. The brands, KPMG, thank you so much for hosting, Bina and Lord Simon, all of our review committees. This was an idea on a scrap of paper a couple of years ago, and many didn't know too much about intersectionality, and so I want to give huge thanks. I'm rather emotional given hormones at the moment, so I'll try not to get too emotional, but I would love just to bring up some of the team. Flick, come on, get up here, please. And also our trustees as well, if that's all right. Susie, you get... I actually just wanted to give a bunch of flowers, and I've realised that you have one too, so I'm like, I got mine out first. Can I get the rest of the team up here, please, and also our trustees? Susie, come on. Up here, and Andy as well. Just to say a big thank you, because honestly, we couldn't have done it without all of our partners. Andrew, Susie, Flix, our group chief of staff, Clarissa, Jodie, Kate, Michael, Jane, Gio, Mandy, and Michelle, who I know is watching at home. She's got COVID, unfortunately, who is the MD of our foundation. She's backed this from day dot, and she's absolutely devastated that she can't be here. So, Michelle, these are for you, and Flick, these are for you. But I hope... Oh, thank you.
And I would just like to say, so the lady doesn't know I'm going to do this either, so none of this would have been possible without the incredible vision of this lady stood here and her absolute tenacity and resilience to make this happen. So many people told Layla that it wasn't possible, it couldn't be done, and look, we're in our second year of the UK and we're in our first ever year of the US as well. So I think a massive round of applause to Layla as well.
So hopefully you'll all join us for some drinks as well now, because we'd love to chat to you all and hear all about some of your stories from the review and let you wind down and network with one another. So do just join us outside of the doors here, courtesy of KPMG. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That to each other.